Did medieval women just bake bread and weave cloth? Were their hands only soft, meant for delicate tasks indoors? What if their fingerprints were etched into the very soil of the Middle Ages, shaping the land from 500 to 1500 AD, prepared to challenge everything you thought you knew? Number 9, women's agricultural contributions were negligible to the overall economy. The common story often goes something like this: medieval economies were driven by powerful men, knights, lords, and kings, with a sprinkling of male merchants and craftsmen. The agricultural output, the very foundation of society, seems to be credited almost entirely to the strong backs of men plowing fields and harvesting crops. That women in this picture are often relegated to the sidelines, their work portrayed as domestic, supporting the primary male breadwinners, but not truly contributing to the larger economic engine. Their work, perhaps, was just about feeding the family, a small, isolated circle of subsistence that barely registered on the grand scale of kingdoms and trade routes. This view suggests that if you removed women from the medieval agricultural landscape, the overall economy might wobble a bit, but it certainly wouldn't collapse. Their efforts, while maybe helpful, were not seen as indispensable, nor were they considered a significant driving force in the wealth or stability of a manor, a village, or even a nascent nation. It implies that the essential food supply, the production of raw materials, and the surplus that fueled markets and trade were primarily the domain of male labor. This narrative paints a picture of women's work as a secondary, almost invisible, component of the medieval economic machine, easily overlooked when tallying up the true wealth and productivity of the era. The vast fields, the bustling markets, the thriving manors, these were, according to this misinterpretation, predominantly male creations. Now, let's step onto a different kind of medieval earth. The reality of medieval agriculture tells a story far more complex and intertwined. The survival of a medieval household, a village, and indeed a kingdom, hinged on food. Every single person needed to eat, and the vast majority of the population lived in rural areas, making their living from the land. Women's involvement in this fundamental industry was not just supportive, it was elemental, a bedrock without which the entire edifice of medieval society would crumble. Consider the diverse activities that fall under the umbrella of agriculture. It is not merely plowing and sowing grain. It encompasses animal husbandry, dairy production, horticulture, processing harvested goods, managing resources, and participating in local markets. Women were deeply embedded in all these facets. For instance, the care of smaller livestock, chickens, geese, ducks, pigs, was often primarily a woman's responsibility. These animals provided vital protein, eggs, and fat, essential for daily sustenance and for generating income. A goose egg, for example, could be traded for other goods or sold for a small coin, directly contributing to the household's monetary resources. Without these contributions, the family would face severe nutritional deficits and economic strain. Moreover, dairy production was overwhelmingly the domain of women. Milking cows, goats, and sheep, churning butter, and making cheese were laborious daily tasks. These products were not just for family consumption, they were critical commodities in local markets. Cheese in particular was a valuable item that could be stored and transported, providing a stable source of income for peasant families. Historian Judith M. Bennett, in her extensive work on medieval women's lives, emphasizes the significant economic impact of female labor in dairy and poultry, noting how these activities often provided a crucial cash flow for families, enabling them to pay rents or purchase necessary goods. The very sustenance of a village often depended on the consistent production of these female-dominated sectors. The butter and cheese made by women fed not only their own families, but also the local nobility, urban populations, and traveling merchants, forming a vital part of regional food networks. Without the steady supply of these goods, the medieval diet would have been poorer, and trade networks would have been significantly disrupted. Beyond animal products, women were heavily involved in the cultivation of garden plots and orchards. While field crops like wheat and barley were central to calorie intake, gardens provided essential vegetables, herbs, and fruits. These small-scale plots, often tended exclusively by women, offered dietary diversity and medicinal plants. Surplus produce could be sold or bartered in the village market, again providing an independent source of income or valuable exchange. The economic importance of these garden plots should not be underestimated. They represented a significant source of nutrition and potential for market participation, particularly for landless or poorer families who might not have access to vast fields. A study by Martha Carlin from 2005 on urban food supplies frequently points to the role of women as purveyors of garden produce and dairy in city markets, demonstrating their direct link to broader economic systems. Their efforts in these areas directly supported the health and economic viability of their communities, contributing to the overall agricultural output in ways that are often overlooked in broad economic histories. The processing of agricultural goods also heavily relied on women's labor. After harvest, grain needed to be threshed, winnowed, and ground into flour. Women were deeply involved in these stages, often spending hours manually grinding grain in household querns or participating in collective milling processes. This processing was not just about preparing food for the family. The flour itself was a commodity. Similarly, the processing of flax into linen or wool into yarn, while not strictly agriculture in the cultivation sense, was inextricably linked to the rural economy and often conducted by women. The raw materials came directly from agricultural endeavors, and the transformed products were integral to trade and household economies. The value added by this female labor, turning raw agricultural products into usable goods, was substantial and directly contributed to the economic value chain. Without the meticulous and time-consuming efforts of women in these processing stages, the raw output of the fields would have had little market value or practical use. Even in direct fieldwork, women were indispensable, especially during peak seasons like harvest and planting. While men might have handled the heavy plowing, women participated in sowing, weeding, gleaning, and binding sheaves. Gleaning, for example, involved collecting leftover grain after the main harvest. This seemingly minor activity was crucial for many poorer families, providing them with enough food to survive. The aggregate amount of gleanings across a village could represent a significant food resource, demonstrating the economic contribution of what might appear to be marginal labor. Works like those by Georges Duby, although focused broadly on rural economy, hint at the necessity of all available hands during critical agricultural periods, underscoring the collective effort that included women's physical labor in the fields. The total output of a medieval manor, whether it was grain, wool, or dairy, was a summation of diverse labor inputs, many of which were provided by women. Their continuous, multifaceted contributions from daily animal care to seasonal fieldwork and essential processing were not just supplemental, they were absolutely central to the production, sustenance, and economic vibrancy of medieval society. The economy did not just wobble without them, it would have ground to a halt. Number 8. Only peasant women worked in agriculture. A common notion suggests that women's involvement in agriculture was primarily limited to the lowest rung of medieval society, the peasant class. This perspective often pictures noblewomen confined to their castles, overseeing household staff, engaging in needlework, or managing social affairs, far removed from the dirt and toil of the fields. Urban women, in this view, might be shopkeepers or artisans' wives, but their connection to agriculture is seen as indirect, perhaps through buying food at market, but certainly not through direct engagement or management. The image is one where the closer a woman was to power or prosperity, the further she was from the realities of growing food. This idea reinforces a sharp class divide in agricultural labor, implying that manual labor was a mark of low status, and women of higher social standing would avoid it at all costs, delegating all such tasks to those beneath them. It draws a clear line. If you were a lady, you were not involved in farming, at least not in any meaningful way. However, the historical record paints a much broader and more nuanced picture of women's agricultural involvement across the medieval social spectrum. While it is true that peasant women performed the majority of direct manual labor in the fields, the agricultural economy was so pervasive that it touched every social class, and women within those classes played active roles, albeit different ones. Noblewomen, for instance, were often the managers of vast estates, especially when their husbands were away on crusades, at court, or engaged in warfare. These women held significant administrative power over agricultural production. They oversaw bailiffs, reeves, and other estate managers who directly supervised the peasants. Their responsibilities included ensuring fields were properly tilled, harvests were efficiently gathered, rents were collected, and produce was sold. An account from the Domesday Book, a survey of England completed in 1086, occasionally lists women as landowners and holders of manors, indicating direct control over agricultural land. Later medieval account rolls and court records frequently show noblewomen initiating lawsuits over land disputes, negotiating sales of agricultural produce, and directing the repair of farm buildings. Lady Alice de Brienne's household accounts from the early 15th century, for example, reveal meticulous oversight of her Suffolk estate, including decisions about sheep flocks, grain sales, and the hiring of laborers for agricultural tasks. This was not merely passive reception of income, it was active, hands-on management that required a deep understanding of agricultural cycles, markets, and labor. Their decisions directly impacted the productivity and profitability of significant agricultural holdings. Even aristocratic women who did not actively manage estates still had an intimate connection to the land through their dower lands, which were portions of their husband's estate set aside for their support after his death. Managing these dower lands could involve direct agricultural oversight. The revenues from these lands derived from crops, livestock, and rents from tenants were their primary source of income. They had a vested interest in ensuring these lands were productive, making them active participants in the agricultural economy, even if from a distance. The very wealth and sustenance of the nobility were rooted in agriculture, and women, as wives, widows, and daughters, were often crucial conduits for that wealth. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the Middle Ages, certainly didn't plow fields, but her vast wealth and political influence were directly tied to the productivity of her numerous agricultural holdings across France and England. Her administrators reported to her, and her decisions shaped the lives of thousands of agricultural workers. Furthermore, women living in medieval towns also had connections to agriculture. Many urban women were involved in industries that relied heavily on agricultural raw materials. Take the wool and cloth industry. Women spun wool, wove cloth, and dyed fabrics. The wool itself came from sheep raised in agricultural settings. Female brewers used barley, an agricultural product, to make ale, a staple drink. Bakers, often women, transformed grain into bread. These women were not directly working in fields, but their livelihoods were entirely dependent on the agricultural sector's output. They often had direct relationships with farmers, buying their raw materials or selling processed goods back to rural communities. Market women, who were overwhelmingly female, bought agricultural produce from farmers and sold it in towns, acting as vital intermediaries in the food supply chain. A significant portion of urban commerce was based on the movement of agricultural goods, and women were key players in this process. Records from medieval guilds sometimes show women as masters in trades like brewing or baking, demonstrating their independent economic activity rooted in agricultural products. For instance, the tax records and guild ordinances of cities like London or Paris from the 13th and 14th centuries often list numerous female brewers, bakers, and retailers of agricultural produce, showing their undeniable role in the urban agricultural economy. Even within religious orders, convents often managed extensive agricultural lands, with abbesses overseeing the cultivation of fields, orchards, and vineyards, and the raising of livestock. These women, dedicated to spiritual life, were simultaneously shrewd agricultural managers, ensuring the self-sufficiency of their communities through careful stewardship of their land. Records from abbeys like Barking Abbey in England show meticulous management of their agricultural holdings by the abbess and nuns, demonstrating a direct and substantial role in the medieval agricultural economy. So, while the visual image of a medieval woman in agriculture might most commonly be a peasant working in the field, the reality is that women across the social spectrum, from the highest noblewoman to the urban artisan's wife and the nun in a convent, were deeply, actively, and often powerfully connected to the agricultural world that sustained all medieval life. Their involvement was not limited by social status, it merely manifested in different, equally vital ways. Number 7, agricultural work was seen as demeaning or unbefitting for women. It's easy to look back at the Middle Ages through modern eyes and assume that heavy manual labor, especially in the dirt and mud of farming, would have been considered beneath women, particularly those with any social standing or aspiration for respectability. There's a lingering idea that a woman's dignity in medieval society was tied to her domesticity, her softness, and her removal from the harsh realities of the field. This perspective often suggests that agricultural work, while perhaps necessary for survival, was inherently demeaning, something to be avoided if possible, and certainly not a source of pride or societal esteem for women. The stereotype might suggest that women who worked in the fields were seen as poor, uneducated, and somehow less feminine than their counterparts who stayed indoors. This interpretation often implies that agricultural tasks were viewed as inherently male, and women participating in them were doing men's work, which would have been considered inappropriate or undignified for their gender. However, historical evidence paints a very different picture of how agricultural labor, including women's contributions, was perceived in the medieval era. Far from being seen as demeaning, work on the land was the very foundation of medieval existence. It was essential for survival, for the sustenance of families, and for the entire economic structure. In a society where most people lived directly from the land, the ability to work and extract sustenance from the soil was not only respected but revered. It was a skill, a necessity, and a testament to one's contribution to the collective good. Women's participation in this work was therefore not seen as a fall from grace or a mark of shame, but rather as an integral and expected part of their role within the household economy and the wider community. Agricultural calendars and illuminations from medieval manuscripts, such as the Tres Riches Hoyers du Duc de Berry, depict men and women working side by side in fields, performing various tasks like sowing, harvesting, and gleaning. These artistic representations, created for elite audiences, do not portray women in these roles as being in any way undignified or out of place. Instead, they show a harmonious and essential division of labor, where both genders contribute to the vital process of food production. The artists, presumably reflecting contemporary perceptions, present these scenes as natural and honorable aspects of rural life. The visual evidence consistently shows women as active, visible participants in almost every stage of the agricultural cycle, from springtime planting to autumn threshing. Furthermore, medieval legal records and manorial accounts often detail the labor services owed by peasant households, which frequently included the labor of women. These documents treated women's work as a quantifiable and valuable asset, just as men's labor was. For example, a manor court roll might record a widow's obligation to provide a certain number of days of harvest labor, or a fine imposed on a female peasant for neglecting her agricultural duties. These records demonstrate that women's work was formally recognized and assessed, not dismissed as incidental or inconsequential. The very fact that women were held accountable for agricultural labor obligations shows that their participation was both expected and valued within the feudal system. The status of a peasant woman was not diminished by her work in the fields, rather. Her ability to contribute effectively to the household's labor pool was a mark of her economic viability and importance. As historian Barbara Hannawalt notes in her studies of peasant life, the survival of a peasant family depended on the effective utilization of all household labor, including that of women and children, making their contributions indispensable and respected within that context. Even in literature and popular culture of the time, references to women working in the fields or managing farm tasks are not presented with a tone of disparagement. Instead, they often appear as natural and integral parts of the rural landscape. Think of the idealized portrayals of peasant life in pastoral poetry or folk songs, where the industriousness of both men and women is often celebrated. While these artistic depictions might romanticize reality, they do not suggest that women's engagement in farming was considered inherently ignoble. On the contrary, hard work and diligence, regardless of gender, were often seen as virtues in a society where survival depended on them. The notion that women's work was only domestic and confined to the home is a more modern construct. In the medieval period, the household extended far beyond the walls of a dwelling to include the garden, the barn, and often the adjacent fields. The domestic economy was inextricably linked to the agricultural economy. A woman managing the dairy, tending the garden, or assisting with the harvest was performing domestic labor in a very broad sense, because it directly sustained her household. This integration of home and field meant that agricultural work was simply part of the wider scope of responsibilities for many women, and it carried no inherent stigma. Their contributions were a source of strength for their families and communities, deeply valued for their practicality and necessity. They were seen as essential providers, contributors to the very survival of their people, a role that brought with it a distinct kind of respect and social worth rather than any form of degradation. Number 6, women were passive figures, entirely dependent on men for agricultural decisions. The picture often painted of medieval agricultural life places men firmly in control of all significant decisions. They are the ones who decide what to plant, when to sow, how much land to cultivate, and when to sell the produce. Women, in this narrative, are often seen as helpers, executing tasks assigned to them, but having little to no say in the strategic direction of the farm or the household's agricultural endeavors. Their role is portrayed as purely operational, devoid of agency or the power to make meaningful choices about the land, the crops, or the livestock. This perspective implies that women lack the necessary knowledge, authority, or perhaps even the inclination to engage in such complex decision-making processes, leaving all strategic planning to the male head of the household or the lord of the manor. However, historical records tell a different story, revealing women as active and often indispensable decision-makers in various aspects of medieval agriculture. The level of agency and decision-making power a woman held could vary significantly based on her social status, marital status, and local customs, but it was rarely non-existent. For many peasant households, which formed the vast majority of the population, agricultural decisions were often a collaborative effort between husband and wife. While the husband might have been the legal head of the household, daily management and long-term planning required both partners. For example, decisions about household food storage, which crops to preserve, and how to manage the kitchen garden for the family's sustenance were often firmly within the woman's domain. These were not minor decisions. They directly impacted the family's survival, especially during lean months. As historian Marjorie K. McIntosh describes in her detailed studies of English village life, the division of labor often meant women specialized in areas like dairy production and horticulture, and therefore held significant decision-making authority over these specific agricultural sectors. They knew the best time to churn butter, which cow was healthy for milking, or what herbs to plant for medicinal purposes. When a husband was away, incapacitated, or had died, women often stepped into roles of full agricultural management. Widows, in particular, frequently assumed the responsibility for running their farms entirely independently. They made all the critical decisions: leasing land, hiring laborers, purchasing seeds, overseeing the harvest, and negotiating sales of produce at market. Manorial court rolls are filled with instances of widows acting as heads of households, paying rents, being fined for agricultural infractions, and engaging in land transactions. These actions clearly demonstrate their economic and agricultural autonomy. A widow named Agnes, for example, might be recorded in a 13th century court roll from Wakefield Manor, purchasing rights to pasture her animals, selling a portion of her grain, and negotiating a lease for an additional strip of land. Such records are direct evidence of women's active and crucial decision-making in agricultural matters. These women were not merely holding the fort, they were actively managing, adapting, and innovating to ensure the continued productivity and economic viability of their holdings. Their ability to make sound agricultural decisions was vital for their survival and the economic stability of their communities. Beyond the peasant class, noblewomen, as discussed earlier, often managed extensive agricultural estates. Their decisions concerning estate management, from approving crop rotations to setting rents and overseeing market strategy, had far-reaching economic consequences. These decisions required considerable agricultural knowledge, shrewd business acumen, and a proactive approach. Countess Isabella de Fortibus, a prominent English noblewoman of the 13th century, provides a compelling example of a woman who effectively managed a vast portfolio of estates, making complex decisions about land use, livestock, and market engagement, directly influencing agricultural productivity across large regions. Her administrative prowess in overseeing numerous manors, each with its own agricultural rhythm and challenges, highlights a level of decision-making that was anything but passive. Even women in urban settings, who might not have directly worked the land, made crucial agricultural decisions that impacted their livelihoods. A female brewer decided which grains to buy and from whom, how much to produce, and at what price to sell her ale. A woman selling produce at the market decided what to purchase from the farmers, what prices to set, and how to manage her inventory. These were all agricultural decisions that directly influenced the flow of goods and money within the medieval economy. They required independent judgment, an understanding of market dynamics, and the courage to take risks. These women were not just passive conduits. For goods, they were active agents shaping the economic landscape through their daily choices related to agricultural products. The idea of women as consistently passive in medieval agriculture is a simplification that ignores the immense practical responsibilities and economic power many women wielded through their direct involvement in and astute decision-making about the land and its bounty. Their actions were not merely responses to male directives. They were often independent, well-informed choices that shaped their lives and the broader economy. Number 5. Women were only involved in subsistence farming for their own families. A common misconception suggests that medieval women's agricultural work was almost exclusively focused on subsistence, meaning they produced just enough food for their own household to eat, with little or no surplus for trade or sale. This perspective often confines their role to the immediate domestic sphere, implying that their efforts were solely geared towards feeding their family members, and that any commercial activity or engagement with broader markets was the exclusive domain of men. It paints a picture of women toiling away in small garden plots or tending a few chickens, entirely isolated from the larger economic currents of the medieval world, detached from the buying and selling that defined commercial agriculture. This view assumes that the concept of generating profit or contributing to a market economy through agricultural means was beyond their scope or responsibility. However, historical records clearly demonstrate that medieval women were significant participants in the commercial aspects of agriculture, frequently producing surpluses for sale and engaging directly in local and regional markets. Their involvement extended far beyond merely feeding their own families. They were active economic agents contributing to wider trade networks. For instance, the production of dairy products was a major commercial endeavor in many medieval villages, and it was primarily managed and carried out by women. Surplus milk was churned into butter or pressed into cheese, both of which were valuable commodities that could be easily transported and sold at market. And manor accounts and toll records from various medieval towns frequently document women selling dairy products, eggs, and poultry. For example, the records from the market town of Colchester in the 14th century show numerous women listed as sellers of butter, cheese, and eggs, indicating a consistent and economically significant participation in commercial food trade. These were not just incidental sales, they were often regular activities that provided crucial income for peasant families, allowing them to pay rents, purchase tools, or acquire other necessities. Beyond dairy and poultry, women were also heavily involved in selling surplus produce from their garden plots. While garden cultivation might seem small scale, the cumulative effect of many women selling their excess vegetables, fruits, and herbs in local markets was substantial. These markets were often vibrant hubs where women were the primary vendors of fresh produce, directly connecting rural producers with urban consumers. They were adept at judging market demand, setting prices, and managing their sales. The Liber Albus, a collection of London city ordinances from the 15th century, includes regulations concerning market vendors, and women are frequently mentioned as sellers of various foodstuffs, including garden produce. This demonstrates a formal recognition of their commercial role. The money earned from these sales was not simply pocket money, it was often essential to the household economy, sometimes providing the only reliable source of ready cash. Furthermore, women were involved in the processing of agricultural raw materials into marketable goods. Consider the production of ale. Brewing was a common female occupation throughout the Middle Ages, both in rural areas and towns. Women would brew ale from surplus barley or other grains and then sell it, either from their homes or in public taverns. This was a direct conversion of an agricultural product into a commercial commodity, often managed entirely by women. The income generated from ale sales could be substantial, and women often held monopolies or licenses for brewing within certain villages or towns, indicating a significant commercial enterprise. Records from Durham Priory in the 14th century, for example, show numerous women holding licenses to brew and sell ale, illustrating their established commercial role in the agricultural economy. Even in larger scale operations, women were involved in selling surplus grain or livestock. While men might oversee the direct sale of large quantities of grain to merchants or at regional fairs, women in wealthy peasant or gentry households often handled the smaller, but equally important, sales within the local community. They might sell sacks of grain to less fortunate neighbors or trade livestock at local markets. When noblewomen managed estates, they were deeply involved in decisions about selling large quantities of agricultural produce, whether grain, wool, or animals, to maximize income. The accounts of the estates of Lady Alice de Brian explicitly detail her sales of grain, wool, and livestock, showing her as a major economic player in the agricultural market. The idea that women were solely confined to subsistence farming neglects the dynamic and entrepreneurial spirit many medieval women exhibited. They were not merely laborers, but active participants in the commercial networks that underpinned the medieval economy, turning the fruits of their agricultural labor into cash and trade goods that sustained their families and contributed to the wealth of their communities. Their market stalls, their brewing kettles, and their dairy churning were all powerful symbols of their commercial agency in the agricultural world. Number 4. Women had no land rights or economic agency related to agriculture. Persistent misinterpretation suggests that medieval women, particularly in the agricultural sphere, were devoid of any real land rights or economic agency. This narrative often paints them as legally invisible, unable to own, inherit, or control land, and therefore entirely dependent on male relatives for their economic security and access to agricultural resources. The assumption is that land, being the primary source of wealth and power, was exclusively the domain of men, passed from father to son, with women having no legal standing to acquire, manage, or dispose of it. This view limits women's involvement in agriculture to mere labor, disconnected from any ownership or decision-making power regarding the most fundamental asset, the land itself. However, historical evidence presents a more complex and often surprising reality concerning medieval women's land rights and their resulting economic agency in agriculture. While legal systems varied across regions and centuries, and women often faced limitations, they were far from completely disenfranchised. Perhaps the most common way medieval women acquired land rights was through dower. Upon marriage, a portion of the husband's land, typically 1/3, was often designated as the wife's dower, which she would control and derive income from if she outlived him. This land provided her with economic independence as a widow, allowing her to manage agricultural operations, collect rents from tenants, and make decisions about its use. A widow who inherited dower land became a significant landowner in her own right, often overseeing peasant tenants and managing the agricultural output of her portion of the estate. Many medieval wills and charters attest to women inheriting and controlling such dower lands, demonstrating their legal and economic power over agricultural resources. For example, manorial court rolls regularly show widows exercising their right to dower, leasing out parts of their lands, or pursuing legal action against those who encroached upon them. Beyond dower, women could also inherit land directly, especially in the absence of male heirs. In some regions, like parts of England or parts of France governed by customary law, daughters could inherit equally with sons if there were no male siblings, or they might inherit exclusively if they were the sole surviving child. This meant that women could become substantial landowners, holding control over entire agricultural estates. These women were then responsible for the agricultural productivity of their lands, collecting feudal dues, managing laborers, and engaging in agricultural commerce. The records of medieval English noble families, for instance, frequently show instances of great heiresses who brought vast landholdings into their marriages or managed them independently as widows, significantly impacting the agricultural landscape. The example of Eleanor de Montfort, Countess of Leicester, who controlled numerous estates in the 13th century, illustrates how noblewomen could wield immense power through inherited land. Furthermore, women, particularly wealthy single women or widows, could purchase and sell land, participate in land markets, and engage in various forms of agricultural transactions. Court records often contain cases where women are plaintiffs or defendants in land disputes, indicating their active participation in the legal framework surrounding land ownership. They leased land, sold crops, and managed livestock, all of which were transactions involving significant economic agency related to agricultural assets. For instance, a woman might sell her future harvest to a merchant for immediate cash, or lease out part of her pasture land to a neighbor. These were not just passive activities, they required active decision-making and legal capacity. The Cartulary of Saint Bertin, a collection of charters from the 11th and 12th centuries in northern France, contains numerous examples of women involved in land transactions, often independently and without male co-signatories, highlighting their legal capacity to manage agricultural property. Even peasant women, while not owning vast tracts of land, often held rights to strips of land in the open fields or garden plots associated with their tenements. These rights, though communal, provided them with a direct stake in agricultural production. They could also hold tenancy agreements for land, leasing it from a lord or another peasant. Manorial court rolls detail numerous instances of women as tenants, paying rents, and performing labor services associated with their landholdings. These women had a vested interest in the productivity of their plots and made daily decisions about their cultivation. A peasant woman, recorded in a 14th century court record, might be seen exchanging parcels of land with a neighbor to consolidate holdings or settling disputes over common grazing rights. Such actions demonstrate their engagement with the practicalities and legalities of land use. In summary, medieval women, far from being completely dispossessed, navigated, and actively participated in the complex system of land tenure. Whether through dower, inheritance, purchase, or tenancy, many women held significant rights and exercised substantial economic agency over agricultural land. These rights directly empowered them to contribute to, manage, and profit from the agricultural economy, challenging the idea of them as merely passive, landless laborers. Their control over land was a fundamental source of their economic power and social standing in a land-based society. Number 3. Women's work was strictly separated from men's work. A prevailing stereotype of medieval agriculture often portrays a rigid division of labor based strictly on gender. In this view, men are seen as performing all the heavy outdoor tasks like plowing, sowing, and harvesting main field crops, while women are confined to lighter, indoor domestic duties such as cooking, spinning, and tending to the immediate household. This narrative suggests that there was a clear, almost impenetrable boundary between men's work and women's work in the medieval agricultural economy, with little to no overlap or flexibility. It implies that certain tasks were inherently male and others inherently female, and that individuals rarely crossed these prescribed lines of labor. However, historical sources reveal a much more fluid and pragmatic division of labor in medieval agriculture, where gender roles were often complementary and flexible, adapting to seasonal demands, economic necessity, and household circumstances. While certain tasks might have been typically associated with one gender, the reality was that men and women frequently worked side by side, shared responsibilities, and often stepped into roles traditionally associated with the other gender when circumstances required. The idea of a strict, unchanging separation is a simplification of a complex, dynamic system. Take, for example, the main field crops like wheat and barley. While plowing was usually a male task involving oxen or horses and heavy equipment, women were indispensable at almost every other stage. During sowing, women often followed the plow, scattering seeds. In the crucial harvest season, which was the most labor-intensive time of the year, all available hands were needed. Women participated extensively in reaping, binding sheaves, and carrying them to the threshing floor. Illumination from various medieval manuscripts, such as the Luttrell Psalter from the early 14th century, vividly depict men and women working together in the fields during harvest, cutting grain with sickles, gathering stalks, and piling sheaves. This visual evidence clearly contradicts the notion of strict segregation. It shows a collective, shared effort where gender was less important than the immediate need for labor. Gleaning, the collecting of leftover grain after the main harvest, was almost exclusively a female activity, crucial for supplementing the household food supply, demonstrating a distinct but vital contribution to the overall grain economy. Beyond fieldwork, many tasks were performed by both men and women, or were traditionally women's, but men would assist, and vice versa. For instance, the care of animals was often shared. While men might be responsible for larger draft animals like oxen and horses used for plowing, women typically handled smaller livestock such as chickens, geese, ducks, and pigs. However, in smaller households or during peak seasons, men might help with milking cows or tending to pigs. Similarly, women often managed dairy production, but men might assist with heavier tasks involved in cheesemaking or transporting dairy products to market. Records from medieval monastic estates, for example, sometimes mention male laborers assisting with dairy processing, particularly when large quantities were involved. Processing of agricultural products further blurs the lines. While grinding grain might have been a household task for women, men often operated communal mills. Similarly, women were the primary spinners and weavers of flax and wool, but men were involved in the cultivation of flax or the shearing of sheep. The production of ale was largely a female occupation, but men often worked as coopers, making the barrels needed for storage and transport. The overlap was less about rigid rules and more about efficiency and practicality. If a man was skilled at weaving, he might weave. If a woman was strong enough to help with threshing, she would. As historian Judith M. Bennett frequently points out, the household economy of the medieval period was a unified productive unit, where men and women often worked together on interdependent tasks to ensure the family's survival and prosperity. Furthermore, economic necessity often dictated flexibility in gender roles. If a household was short-staffed due to illness, death, or absence, the remaining members, regardless of gender, would take on whatever tasks were necessary. Widows, for example, routinely performed men's work when they became heads of households, managing all aspects of their farms, including tasks typically associated with men, such as hiring plowmen or overseeing field rotation. Similarly, if a man was injured, his wife might step in to manage tasks that were usually his. The boundaries were porous, especially at the peasant level where survival depended on maximizing all available labor. The idea of rigid gender separation is a modern imposition that doesn't fully capture the cooperative, adaptive, and often desperate reality of medieval agricultural life, where practical survival often trumped idealized gender roles. Number 2, women's agricultural work was unskilled and low value. There is a pervasive belief that the work medieval women performed in agriculture was largely unskilled, routine, and therefore of low value compared to the specialized trades or heavy labor typically associated with men. This perspective often dismisses women's contributions as mere brute force or simple repetition, not requiring particular expertise, knowledge, or decision-making abilities. It suggests that anyone could do what women did in the fields or around the farm, implying that their work was easily replaceable and held little inherent economic or social worth beyond simply existing. This misinterpretation often focuses on the physical effort involved without recognizing the nuanced skills, knowledge, and judgment that were integral to many of women's agricultural tasks. However, a closer look at the actual activities medieval women engaged in within agriculture reveals that much of their work was highly skilled, required specialized knowledge, and contributed immense value to the household and wider economy. These tasks were far from simple and often demanded expertise accumulated over years of experience and passed down through generations. Consider, for example, the management of dairy animals and the production of dairy products. Milking cows, goats, or sheep effectively requires knowledge of animal health, proper handling, and understanding of lactation cycles. Churning butter and making cheese, primary female activities are complex processes demanding precision, temperature control, and an understanding of fermentation. Different cheeses require different techniques, and successful production meant the difference between a valuable, marketable product and spoiled milk. This was not unskilled labor, it was a craft that directly supported the family's nutrition and income. As historian Mary W. Erler highlights in her work on medieval women, the skills involved in dairy production were sophisticated and essential, making women key economic producers. Furthermore, women were often the primary cultivators of kitchen gardens and herb plots. This was not just haphazard digging. It involved intricate knowledge of various plants, what to plant in which season, which soils they preferred, how to combat pests, and how to harvest and preserve them. This included knowledge of medicinal herbs, their properties, and how to prepare them for remedies. This horticultural knowledge was vital for family health and often provided additional income through the sale of surplus herbs or vegetables. A medieval woman's garden was a living pharmacy and larder, requiring skilled management to flourish. Without this expertise, families would have lacked critical dietary variety and access to basic medicine. Processing agricultural products also required specialized skills. Women were extensively involved in turning raw materials into usable forms. Threshing grain, winnowing it, and grinding it into flour, for instance, involved specific techniques to maximize yield and quality. Preparing flax for linen involved retting, scutching, and spinning, each a delicate process requiring deft hands and specific knowledge to produce fine thread. Similarly, processing wool into yarn required cleaning, carding, and spinning, skills that determine the quality and value of the finished textile. These were not simply repetitive motions. They were artisanal processes that added significant value to the raw agricultural output. The quality of the thread or flour directly impacted the family's ability to sell or trade these goods. Medieval household account books often show the purchase of raw materials and the sale of processed goods, reflecting the value added by women's skilled labor. Moreover, women often specialized in certain forms of animal husbandry, particularly the care of smaller livestock like poultry and pigs. This involved knowledge of breeding, feeding, and disease prevention, crucial for maintaining healthy animals that provided eggs, meat, and offspring for sale. The daily care of these animals, from collecting eggs to ensuring proper foraging, was meticulous and necessary for their productivity. The economic contribution of these animals, often managed by women, was substantial, proving their skilled stewardship. Finally, even in common fieldwork tasks like gleaning required keen observation and persistence. Sowing seeds accurately and efficiently by hand, or binding sheaves tightly for storage, were skills that improved over time with practice and precision. The ability to perform these tasks effectively meant greater yields and less waste, directly impacting the household's economic well-being. The notion that women's agricultural work was unskilled stems from a modern bias that undervalues tasks traditionally performed by women. In the medieval context, these activities were fundamental, demanded specific expertise, and were deeply valued for their direct contribution to survival and prosperity, demonstrating a clear and undeniable economic and social worth. Number 1. Women were only domestic housewives, never active in fields. The most widespread and persistent misinterpretation about medieval women's roles in agriculture is the idea that they were primarily confined to the domestic sphere, occupied solely with household chores like cooking, cleaning, child-rearing, and textile production, and rarely, if ever, ventured into the fields. This image often portrays them as delicate figures, ill-suited for the demanding physical labor of farming, and culturally expected to remain within the confines of their homes or immediate garden plots. The traditional narrative largely segregates them from the agricultural landscape, attributing all direct involvement with fieldwork, from plowing to harvesting, to men. This leads to a simplified picture where the man of the house is the farmer and the woman of the house is merely his supportive indoor counterpart. However, historical records, visual evidence, and manorial accounts unequivocally demonstrate that medieval women were not only active but indispensable participants in nearly all aspects of agricultural fieldwork. Their presence in the fields was a fundamental and visible reality of medieval rural life, driven by economic necessity, customary practice, and the sheer demand for labor to sustain communities. The idea of them being solely domestic is a modern imposition that completely overlooks the integrated nature of the medieval household and its inseparable link to the land. Consider the agricultural calendar, which dictated the rhythm of life for the vast majority of medieval people. During peak seasons, especially planting in spring and harvesting in late summer and autumn, every available hand was needed in the fields. Labor was a precious commodity, and a household's survival depended on mobilizing all its members. Women, young and old, were crucial to these efforts. In spring, women often participated in harrowing, breaking up clods of earth after plowing and sowing seeds, following behind the men who managed the heavier plows. They carried baskets of seeds and scattered them carefully, a task that required both strength and precision. The harvest season, however, was where women's direct involvement in fieldwork became most prominent and visible. This was a period of intense, backbreaking labor that required the entire village to mobilize. Women worked alongside men, using sickles to cut grain, gathering the cut stalks into sheaves, and binding them. They then carried these heavy sheaves to carts or directly to the threshing floor. Medieval illuminated manuscripts, such as the Tresrich's Hers du Duc de Berry or the Luttrell Psalter, contain numerous depictions of rural life, consistently showing women engaged in these harvest activities. These images are not exceptions, they are portrayals of the norm, illustrating women cutting grain, raking, and carrying heavy bundles, demonstrating their physical presence and labor in the very heart of the fields. Manorial, court rolls, and labor records frequently detail the boon work, customary labor services owed to the Lord performed by women during harvest, specifying their involvement in tasks like reaping and carrying. Beyond the main crops, women were vital to other types of field work that often occurred outside the immediate homestead. They managed and worked in vineyards, especially during the grape harvest, where they picked grapes and participated in the early stages of wine production. In regions where flax was grown for linen, women were instrumental in harvesting, readying, and processing the plant, tasks that took place in fields and water-filled ditches. The care of livestock, particularly smaller animals like sheep and pigs, often involved women driving them to pasture or moving them between enclosures. While men might shear sheep, women often helped with the herding and management of the flocks. Furthermore, gleaning, the practice of collecting leftover grain after the main harvest, was almost exclusively a female activity, often performed by women and children. This task, while appearing marginal, was critical for the survival of many poor families, providing them with enough food to make it through the winter. This took place directly in the harvested fields, often for days or weeks after the main harvest, showcasing women's continued presence and labor on the land. The argument that women were solely domestic fundamentally misunderstands the medieval household. The household was not just the physical dwelling, it was an economic unit that encompassed the dwelling, the garden, the barn, the livestock, and the surrounding fields. Agricultural work was not an external activity distinct from domestic life, it was an integral part of it. A woman's domestic duties inherently included tasks that took her directly into the fields, barns, and pastures because these were extensions of her household economy. Her ability to provide food for her family directly depended on her involvement in the entire cycle of food production, much of which happened outdoors and in the field. Therefore, the image of medieval women as only domestic housewives, detached from the demanding realities of fieldwork, is a significant misinterpretation. They were in fact active, visible, and utterly essential partners in the agricultural labor that fed and sustained medieval society.